My name is Ian Pouncey. I'm a web developer and accessibility specialist from the UK, and I'm going to talk to you about how to make an inaccessible website. So I have a lot of things from Twitter. This is what inspired my talk. This one says, hate those self-proclaimed web accessibility expert in the company who never did proper web development. So I should introduce myself, I guess. I am a former web developer. And probably before that, I was what you might call a full-stack developer, which meant that I wrote pretty bad Perl, did some Apache configuration, and a load of front-end stuff. But since then, I've done a few things you might have heard of. I was a developer on the Yahoo homepage team in around 2007, when it was still something like the third most popular homepage on the web. And then after that, I worked for the BBC on the front-end frameworks team, writing things like click tracking, always people's popular thing, cookie banner stuff, and more visible stuff like the header and footer. So I've since moved on from that, and these days most of the work I do is helping designers and developers make accessible and hopefully usable websites and applications. So my views in this are to some extent shaped by that as much as by my time as a developer. Another tweet. Sometimes I hate web accessibility with the burning passion of 1,000 fiery suns. Yeah, so again, it's tweets like this that made me want to write this talk. It makes me pretty sad. I think about the people who write comments like this, and I go to quite a few conferences, and I see lots of talks about how to make things accessible. But that's obviously not what this person wants to do. They hate web accessibility. So where are the conference talks for them to tell them how to make something inaccessibly? These people are, I think, they're sort of losing the battle. They know they're probably going to be seen as behind the times, but still they persist. So I would just like you all have a bit of audience participation. If you could close your eyes and bow your heads and just think about the bravery of the men who say things like this on the internet. If you all close your eyes now, please. I can still see open eyes. Okay, that's enough. They don't really deserve it. I would like to apologize a little bit. I said men there, I used some gendered language. I'd like to apologize, but it is almost always men who say things like this on the internet, unfortunately. I don't know if there are any men here, but maybe think about this. Anyway, on with the show. We're going to talk about CSS first. But before I sort of go into the details, I'd just like to tell a bit of a story. When I started messing around on the web in about 1995. In the year 2000, I became a professional web developer. I was making things with tables, table layouts, and font tags, and all sorts of things like that. And then I knew that you could do things with CSS like remove the underlines from links. And then a bit later on, I discovered that you could put the underlines back on when people hovered over them. But I also knew that you could do more with that. And I read a book. This is Cascading Style Sheets, The Definitive Guide by someone called Eric A. Mayer, who I think may be in the audience. And I just read this cover to cover in a few days, and it honestly changed the way I did web development. So thank you very much, Eric. So, CSS. What we're going to do is think about how we can make a website that's inaccessible to people with disabilities, but without affecting anyone else. So there are examples on the web of how you can make the most inaccessible website. And you end up with something that just has nothing on the screen at all. And that's not what we're about. We really shouldn't be noticing this. There's only like 1 in 5 people in the world who have a disability of some sort, so we need to just think about the 4 in 5 people and make sure that they don't have any problems with what we write. So I start with something really basic. I'm sure you've all seen something like this. This is a focus style, so this is when you're using a keyboard, maybe tabbing through links and controls, and you see an outline on it. Well, we can remove that with outline none. It's probably one of the most talked about things in accessibility that you shouldn't do. And it's really about as simple as inaccessibility gets. I'm going to use a lot of tweets, so I've just taken some examples from Twitter. This is a little bit of a navigation. I think this is the current UI. And we've got a hover effect on the home link there. Just giving that a little outline. It's the blue bottom border. But as you can see, when you focus on it, nothing at all, just an empty space. So it's a very small thing, but we've managed to make this site already pretty much inaccessible to anyone using a keyboard and navigating. So this is a good start. Now, Twitter have done this a slightly different way, outline 0, but they're basically the same thing. Now, sorry, this is the new UI. So they've abandoned this approach in the new UI, and they've actually got a really nice blue outline on it when you focus on it. It's really good. Now, a few people have talked about making this a little bit more difficult. So rather than use CSS, what they've done is they have an event listener looking for the focus event, which changes a class on the control, and then they have listening for another event to remove that class. So, instead of using a couple of lines of CSS, they've done this the hard way, but it's the thought that counts. Another tweet. I have a love-hate relationship with web accessibility. I love the idea of it. I love enforcing it, but I hate coding it. So tedious. And I think this is what happens when you implement things in the same way that Twitter has there. That they've made something that should be pretty straightforward into something that's really, really arduous, and it causes this sort of reaction. I think I would hate coding this as well if I have to do that for every time I wanted to do something simple as a focus style. Okay, going to move on to something a bit more difficult. So this is tables. We had a great talk about tables before. And you saw a demonstration of a table being inaccessible when a screen reader is running. And this actually shows how you achieve that in one of the ways. So it's just a simple table. It's not very pretty, but we've got a nice caption for it. We've got some column headers, we've got row headers, and we've got some data there. And I want to introduce you to the accessibility tree. So when a piece of software like a screen reader is accessing content, so a screen reader is speaking out the content that's on the screen, it's actually passing an accessibility tree. It's very similar to the DOM, but it contains a little bit more information. So here we can see that for the cell that contains the text of 1040, that is a row header. We can see some column headers up there. There's a caption bit. So it's a tree of all the content, but it's showing some of the accessibility roles as well as just the text. Now, so the aim of this is that we want to make this inaccessible to screen readers. So pretty much all we need to do is put something like DisplayBlock on it. It's really not going to make any difference, to the rendering of the table. It may make it a little different in width, but it's not going to make a big difference. But maybe you can see that the cell that used to be a row header is now just a cell. It doesn't have that same accessibility information because that simple bit of CSS has removed the semantics from the table. It's no longer a table. Now, Alina has showed you how to use roles to fix this. That's how you would make it accessible again. But we don't really care about that. We care about making it inaccessible, not accessible. So again, this is just a very simple bit of CSS, one property, 3 lines, and no real visible change, but we've made something very simply inaccessible. So the important thing is we've managed to lock out a significant number of people in your audience, people with a lot of money to spend, billions perhaps. And it really hasn't cost us anything to do that. So I want to move on to HTML, and I'm going to include way area in this, area standing for accessible, rich internet applications. And way area is a technology that just exists to talk to assistive technologies like screen readers. It doesn't really it doesn't change anything in the DOM. It just changes things in that accessibility tree I showed you. So because of this, it's a good idea to understand as much as possible about both HTML and way area if you want to make the least accessible possible experience for people. Because only by understanding these technologies can you really, really make things difficult for people. So a little bit of aria. This is aria hidden, aria-hidden equals true. And what this does is remove something completely from that accessibility tree. It just won't exist at all, completely gone. And if you're using a screen reader, you won't even know that it's missing at all. There's just no hint about its presence whatsoever. So we can really do some big things with making this inaccessible. But the problem is we're having to just put it on every element. And going back to this love-hate relationship with the web, they hate coding it, and it's so tedious. Now, you don't want to apply an attribute to every element just to make it inaccessible. Instead, we can just put it on the body, and then the entire content of the web page goes away as far as the screen reader is concerned. It's a really efficient way of making something inaccessible. But you might think, where's the art in this? Where's the craft? These are professionals that we're talking about who they want to wield a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. They just happen to be professionals who don't care about the 650+ million people in the world with a disability. So let's see if we can create something a little bit more elegant for them. Here's some advice. The simplest accessibility advice I've ever received: the div is your last resort. Is this your main content? There's a tag for that. Is it your header? That's got a tag. The div isn't bad, it just doesn't mean anything. That means you certainly don't need it for something clickable. So, here's a bit more. After auditing a site, developer says it's a SPA built with Angular 7 and cannot support antiquated things like headings or links. Then proceeded to say that accessibility tools need to be updated to support modern browsers and web capabilities. I want to throw up. So we can heed the advice of this Angular developer and start with something like this. We've got some semantic elements here. It's a boring H1 element. It does have the right semantics. It's going to provide an outline in the document, so you can navigate it with a screen reader. You can just press the H key, and for a screen reader point of view, it'll just skip to this, or even better, because it's an H1, just press the number 1 key, and you'll go straight to it. So follow the advice of the Angular developer. Just use a div instead. We can use divs everywhere, pretty much, that you can use a regular element. Just with a bit of CSS, we can change things from block to inline if we need to, things like that. It's slightly different to using aria hidden. It's not quite as inaccessible as this, but it's pretty good. And in some ways, when it comes to frustrating, say, a screen reader user, it's slightly better because they get a little hint of the content. They get a hint about what this is, but it's frustrating to use a website. So they may think, oh, this website's pretty good, I can get to all the content, but then they discover that all of the structure is gone. So it's inaccessible in a different way, really quite annoying. And as I said, we can do this with any element. Here's a list. It's an ordered list in this case, so we need to add a little bit more text to put the numbers in. And it's just some basic styling to make it look a bit listy. But I think this is a bit ridiculous. I don't think anyone is seriously going to do something like this. It would be unprofessional and thoughtless. And oh dear. Another tweet. Let's check in now live to see some modern JavaScript development writing. This is not a parody, and it's exactly the code we just saw on the last slide. We have a div with a class of UI and list. We've got inside that div class item, which contains the bullets, the numbers. And this comes from a design system library which is apparently completely unironically called Semantic UI, from which they've removed all the semantics. I don't know. Now, Vadik talked about in his design system talk about the use of classes on this, and the classes aren't the problem. But as he said, you can apply those classes to good markup. You don't need to do things like this, but if you want it inaccessible, maybe this is the way. But I do think we've gone a bit too far with this. I can imagine in my days as a developer trying to get this through testing or through a code review with other developers, and they're just going to make fun of this sort of stuff. So what we need to do, I think, is add some more way area. So instead of using divs everywhere, which is pretty obviously inaccessible, we want to try and sneak things past our testers to make it look like we've done things right, but then we remove the accessibility later. So here's another bit of way area. It's a role of presentation. And what this does is strips the semantics out of elements. So this h1 is now just the same as a div or a span or any other semantically neutral element. It's the text shows up in the accessibility tree, but it doesn't tell anyone that it's a heading level 1 anymore. So it's pretty sneaky like that. It lets our inaccessibility developer get things through to production, but still ruin the experience for a lot of people. And we even still get the default styling of a heading if we want, because remember the accessibility tree is something separate. This is still a H1 as far as CSS is concerned. It's still an H1 in the DOM. It's only in the accessibility tree where this is changed. Now you might think it's a bit weird to have an attribute which deliberately removes the semantics from an element. That's really not what accessibility is all about. So why does Y-area have this? I can give you an example. Here is one of those layout tables that we saw before, or we talked about before. It's a pretty standard thing. If you've worked on the web for 20 years, you've almost certainly seen these. You may have written them yourself, or you may be maintaining a site which was built a long time ago and get something like this. Now, from a content order point of view, it's okay. We've got a header, we've got main content, then we've got a sidebar and a footer, so everything's in the right order. It's just the table semantics that are getting in the way. So if we didn't have time to rewrite our code, we could just put role of presentation on the table, and it's not a table anymore. So that's how you would use it correctly. Of course, if you're trying to make it inaccessible, you wouldn't need that at all. Keep the table semantics. It'll confuse people. It's also useful for progressive enhancement. So this is the sort of code that you would have if you were creating a tab panel and making it accessible with way area. We can add roles for custom element types. HTML doesn't have a tab element or a tab list element, but it has things that we can turn into those things with these roles. So we have a role of tab list, which is going to contain the tabs, and each one of those tabs has a role of tab. Now, the problem is here that we've got an li element around each of those tabs, and tab lists don't have li elements. So we can just apply role of presentation, and again, they go away. So it's actually quite a useful bit of area for making things accessible. Here's another the same tweet again. So as we said, use the simplest elements possible, use the things that do the right job. There's a tag for everything, including for things like links. But when is a link not a link? Two of these things are using the same element. They're both A elements. But only one of them has an href attribute. And the href attribute is what turns the A element into something with a role of link. And it also, for free, makes things focusable with a keyboard. And it's also what adds the default events for when you click on it or when you focus in on it and press the Enter key. Without those things, it's just the same as having a span, pretty much. It doesn't do anything interactive. And it doesn't focus by default. But again, if you're trying to sneak things past your QA team to get it through testing, just simply removing an attribute and using JavaScript to do this instead is going to make something really, really inaccessible to a keyboard user with very, very little effort. Now, I've been showing a lot of screenshots of Twitter, so I thought I'd see what they're doing in the background. The new UI, by the way, has received quite a lot of praise for its improved accessibility, so they're actually doing a really good job. But here's a small part of the site. This is from the trending topics page. On the screen we have the number 3, because it's the third most popular trending topic, a little dot, the word trending, and then the topic that's trending, in this case, philanthropist, and then we have the number of tweets. Pretty straightforward, I think. This is the code for it. There's some good stuff in here, actually. So we have tab index 0 up there, which makes it focusable because they want people to be able to click on it, and keyboard users to be able to do the same. It's got a role of link. So as far as a screen reader is concerned, other assistive technologies, this is a link. They've got some weird stuff. So the number 3 there, if you see before it, there's this area hidden equals true, which means that that's removed from the accessibility tree, so screen reader users won't know about the 3-bit. And the same for that dot. But then we have the word trending, we have philanthropists, and we have the number of tweets. So from a screen reader point of view, this is going to get announced as something like trending philanthropist, 6,218 tweets, link. All pretty good. It's not too bad. But the problem is, actually, it's more of a usability one. Even though they've done everything right to make that into what appears to be a link as far as assistive technologies are concerned, it doesn't actually behave like a link. And you may have seen lots of examples of this where divs are turned into links or spans are turned into links. But the context menu doesn't change. It's still just a div. So if I try and open that in a new tab, why wouldn't I want to do that? It doesn't work. So while we can use ARIA to make a lot of custom attributes, we should ask us to make a lot of custom elements out of just divs and spans. We should ask ourselves whether we should or not, because we still don't get the same experience no matter what you do. So this doesn't work for our inaccessible developer, weirdly. Although they've got all the accessibility in there, what they've done here is affect people without a disability, people using a mouse. And there's a bit of a moral to this story, I think. Here's another tweet. While I agree that accessibility is an important thing in web dev, I strongly disagree that when teaching web dev, which is a complex thing on its own, you must touch accessibility as well. Nor that all websites need to be accessible. Only Sith Lords deal in absolutes and all that. Now, I've got to say, this sort of tweet makes me really angry. Say what you like about accessibility, but there's no need to bring Star Wars into this. It might have happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but there were still people on that Death Star. So talking of respect for people, although I'm here with you today advocating for people who want to make things inaccessible, I think the moral for the rest of us is that we shouldn't make decisions for people about who can and can't access websites. So if you ever find yourself thinking, well, people with disability don't need to use this, I think, or developers don't need to do this because they're not working on something that needs to be made accessible, I would just say that that's not your choice, and I think this person is dead wrong. So there's a strange thing about this, as I said, with HTML, that the best way to understand how to make a website inaccessible is really to learn how to make it as accessible as possible. And I would really encourage everyone here who is building websites and applications, even if you are mainly doing this with JavaScript as the language that you do everything, learn HTML. This is what browsers pass. This is what screen readers ultimately see. So JavaScript, onto that. I genuinely don't know where to start with JavaScript. The problem is that it can do everything, and usually the problem with accessibility is that JavaScript hasn't been implemented fully enough. So for example, if you're creating that div with a tab index of 0, a role of link, you still need to be able to use the enter key to activate the control. So I'm not going to go into any code, but I'm going to show you some more tweets which perhaps demonstrate some of the issues I think there are with JavaScript. And they're not all to do with accessibility. Here's a tweet. Did you know Facebook's fbevents.js reads out an inputs value on each single input/key event, found out by patching the input elements getter to monitor what accesses it? This is the Facebook Pixel, which does basically tracking of activity on your website. But here's a scary thing. It also does this with password fields. And so, as Eric Eggert here says, never trust third-party scripts, especially when loading them directly from the third party. I would avoid putting keyloggers on my computer. I really don't want them put into my browser either. Here's another tweet. We've got on screen a screenshot, again, of the Twitter website. This web page is using significant energy. Closing it may improve the responsiveness of your Mac. As Thomas Fuchs says, this website is literally an unordered list of text with maybe a few pictures in between. How did JavaScript and web development ever go so wrong? Good question. But I understand web development these days is difficult. As this tweet says, being a front-end dev means you become responsible for the entire API backend being down just because the button you implemented doesn't do anything when clicked. Because everything is front-end now, you're responsible for everything from a button backwards up the chain. But the problem is we make things more difficult than they need to be. A few people have said this. So let's look at this little bit of the Twitter site, the trending topics. Here's some more code from it. We've got a span inside another span. We've got 14 class values. 8 of them are unique. A whole bunch of CSS here. I'm not going to go through it, but we've got like fonts, families set twice, things like that. And what that does, can you see what it does on here? Anyone spot it? No? It's that dot. So I'm not here to criticize Twitter or the developers making this. I'm very sure there are savings they are making everywhere else to build things in this way. But the problem is when we've got that much code to implement a dot, you're going to make mistakes. There are going to be problems in your implementation, and almost always the thing that suffers first is accessibility when we make things more complicated. Here's a screenshot of a view of a website on a mobile site. We can just about see some content in the background, but we've got a banner at the top saying something how best to experience the website. I assume to set cookies or something, not look at it in .ie or Netscape or whatever. There's an advert in the middle which is going to probably play a video, and at the bottom there's another thing we can just about see for signing up for a please like me, some sort of mailing list, I guess, and we can hardly see any content. As David here says, 1970 to 2000. I liked how websites looked in 1970. It was really good. Websites are not very mobile friendly. Sad face. 2012 to 2016, sub-websites load nice, simple versions on mobile. 2017 until the end of time, we can't see any content anymore because of all the content. And this is because not all the problems that we have on the web are to do with how developers are implementing things. So this is to do with designers and product owners and the decisions that they're making about what sort of content and what sort of features that they add to a website. To tie this back to the little dot, if you as a designer know that it's going to take a developer that much code to implement a dot on the screen, then perhaps think about not having the dot on the screen. Here's a quote from someone called James Edwards. Honestly, the amount of time I waste trying to get clients' custom form controls to be accessible, stop, just stop. Nobody but designers and executives gives two shits if form controls are pretty. This is something I talk about a lot with designers, and because I think he's right. I mean, if you're building a website, I don't know, maybe you're selling insurance or something like that, there is literally none of your customers who are going to go to your website and go, I'm not going to buy insurance from them because they haven't styled their form controls. It's not what users care about, but we're adding complexity to our websites for the sake of it, just because designers and product owners and sometimes developers just want to do that extra thing that they think's fun to do. There's a quote from another accessibility specialist. Your worst accessibility nightmare coming to life in 7 words. I'll start. We launch in 2 weeks. Please help. Go. No, so this is something I hear. This is an awful lot. And the problem here is that accessibility is that thing that you do at the end. It's not something that's considered at the very start, and it really needs to be. It should be considered by designers. It should be considered by people who are deciding on the features of the website. It really is a job for everyone. As most of you are developers here, can I have a show of hands of how many people have received a design from a designer from the UX team that includes information about, let's say, keyboard handling or the structure of a document, like what's a heading, what's an unordered list, things like that. Show of hands. Ooh, 1 person. Congratulations. There's usually somewhere between 0 and 1 people when I ask that question. And you may think, well, these are developer things. We decide what elements they're doing, but they're really not. If you think about it, whether something's a heading or an unordered list, if you are a screen reader user, this is your user experience. Same for keyboard interaction. If you just use a keyboard and don't use a mouse, that is your user experience. It needs to be designed. We'll add it to the backlog is just the polite way of saying no. So anytime you are going to add accessibility later, that just means you are not going to do it, or you may do part of it. Again, hear this all the time. But I want to end on a bit more of a positive note. This is a man I used to work with, David Bailey. Not to sound all-worthy and shit, but as nice as his work was, I find his words far more inspiring. This is talking about Dieter Rams, who was a product designer. He was most famous for working for Brown. A lot of you may have heard of him. He wrote Principles of Good Design, and if you've never read that or never heard of it, I really advise that you do. As part of this, he says, design only works when it seeks to achieve something for humanity, and I think that should apply to the web as well. So, let's talk. We're going to do some questions now, but I'll be around the rest of today. I'll be around tomorrow. So if you want to talk about anything like this, if you want me to rant about web development and shake my fist at the sky, I'm happy to do that. If we want to just approach me, that's fine. Just finally, I'd like to talk about a conference that I help organize. It's just next month, 10th of October. It is a 24-hour conference. We have 24 talks in 24 hours. It's online, it's free, so you just, we stream everything to YouTube. We'll put the URLs on the website. The schedule is already up on this site. Just search for Inclusive Design 24 or go to inclusivedesign24.org. And we have a wide range of subjects all around inclusive design, accessibility, but our topics range from designing and implementing single-page apps through to how to be kind to yourself and deal with anxiety and imposter syndrome. So we have a broad range of topics. So please do come along to that. And with that, thank you for listening.
Ian, thank you so much. Let's go to our chairs. Listening to a British accent is such a pleasure for me.
Well, I hope my English was as good as everyone else who's been speaking today.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Let's start.
Okay. How to sell accessibility to your employer?
Yes, this question always comes up. Right, so depending on where you are in the world, accessibility will be a legal requirement, which is one way of doing it, but I know that doesn't apply everywhere. There are some aspects to accessibility that I don't think you need to sell at all. You can just do them. There's no one on your product team who is going to stop you implementing something in the right way. You know, it doesn't really take any longer to implement the tab panel pattern I showed. It's just a few extra attributes compared to not implementing it. I think the biggest overhead usually for accessibility is actually in testing, not in development. But you know, usually you can just do it. Now, there are some difficulties, I think, in that you can fail at accessibility at the design stage. So this also applies to designers as well when you're choosing things from color schemes all the way through to the content order and the structure of sites. So everyone needs to be on board in making things accessible. But you know, again, it doesn't really take any longer if you know what you're doing and you just think about it at the time. So most of the time, I would say, just do it. And what you're really then trying to do is get the time available for testing of it and things like training. So it's more about paying for that rather than the design and development aspect.
Okay. Do you know the way to at least partially automate accessibility? So there are tools which do tell you that they can automate accessibility, some accessibility overlays as they're called, and they will look through your code and they will apply different roles and different properties. They generally don't work very well. I've not really seen one which does a particularly good job. So there are certainly ways to do testing. So there's lots of accessibility scanners that you can have as, you know, just as part of your development toolkit or as part of your build. And tools are improving all the time. The accessibility tree slide I showed is a feature built into Firefox DevTools now. So you don't really need anything extra than that to figure that out. But no, I mean, you can't really add accessibility automatically. It really needs to be something you build in. Okay.
Could you highlight top websites that fully accessibility adjusted?
So top websites for accessibility.
Yeah.
So there doesn't really exist websites that I don't think have any, lack any accessibility issues. That there isn't sort of perfect sites. There are quite a few banking sites that can be quite good. To plug the BBC, I think that's reasonably good. Some of the other news websites are quite good. The bit where accessibility becomes much more difficult is when you've got complex interactions. But even for something like Gmail, a lot of work does go into it to make it accessible. So I would say that there's very few websites that you can't access to some degree. There are definitely some where there are absolute blockers, but I think usually the problems with accessibility tend to be around how usable it is with something like a screen reader, and some of those things can be just really frustrating. So I can't really recommend any that are perfect or even that good, but look at banking websites, look at news websites, they tend to be reasonably okay.
And very easy question. What is your favorite Iron Maiden song?
My favorite Iron Maiden song is Phantom of the Opera off the first Iron Maiden album. But there are many, many, many to choose from.
Okay, and I think last question, how do you think if HTML elements have built-in accessibility, why CSS was designed without thinking about it,
So CSS is somewhat designed for accessibility. One of the things I do, I'm one of the facilitators of the
CSS Accessibility Task Force, W3C. So there is effort to find problems like this. But there are complex sort of interactions between the CSS specification and how that's implemented in browsers. And sometimes you get these sort of unintended consequences. Sometimes they're intentional. You know, if you're changing, you know, there is display table as a value. So if you're changing that, you're sort of implying that you don't want this to be a table anymore from a structural point of view. And so that's the reason why that particular issue exists. One piece of work that we're hoping to do is create an accessibility API mappings document, which are going to, it will list all of these problems that might crop up if you use CSS inappropriately. So hopefully we'll make it easier for particularly browser implementers to be able to handle these things in the best way.
Okay, and now please choose the best question.
Best question, not the Iron Maiden one. That is the best question, really. The best one about accessibility, it does get asked a lot, but I think it is an important one, so I'm going to choose the how to sell accessibility in your company. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you one more time.
Thank you for having me.
It was very nice to hear you and to see this presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.